The CFL is proving that they are out of touch. It's true. I don't need to elaborate much further. The fans say, we want a 10th team. The league hears that and goes, you want 15-yard end zones. The fans say, we want a video game. The league hears that and goes, yeah, let's make the field shorter. The fans say, capitalize on 2025's anti-American sentiment and bring back the radically Canadian merchandise. And the league goes, yeah, we're going to make the CFL NFL Junior. For those who don't know, on September 22nd, 2025, the CFL's new commissioner, Stuart Johnston, announced a whole bunch of quote-unquote innovations to CFL rules that made CFL fans irate and CFL owners happy because, well, we'll get to that later. The CFL made this laughably stupid list of reasons why every rule change was necessary, so I'm going to go through it one by one and prove how all of them are dumb and will only make the league lose fans rather than gain them. I will try to refute each new rules argument one at a time, but this is going to be impossible because many of the problems with them overlap with the problems of the other rule changes. The rule changes are moving the goalpost to the back of the end zone, decreasing the end zone size from 20 yards deep to 15 yards deep, decreasing the field length from 110 to 100 yards, eliminating a point for an untouched kick out of bounds, adopting an NFL-style 35-second play clock that begins at the end of the previous play, and mandating sideline benches be on opposite sides of the field. The first three rules are all being done in relation to each other. Each change only works because the other two are changing. First, we have the goalpost being moved to the back of the end zone, scheduled to happen in 2027. The first reason given for this is incredibly debunkable. Removes an obstruction for teams trying to score a touchdown. There has been a whopping one touchdown pass attempt that has doinked in 2025. One. And guess what people's reaction to it was? Wow, that's cool. That's interesting. Before that, the last time a pass doinked off the upright was from Ottawa's fourth-string quarterback in 2023, and it was not a touchdown pass because it was in the team's own end zone. Goalpost preventing touchdowns is incredibly rare. To make field goal attempts, which happen in every game, harder because once every year or two a pass goes off the goalpost is garbage reasoning. Now for the stupid "the league projects" part. I have absolutely no clue what metric the CFL was using to determine that this was going to lead to 60 more touchdowns per year. I can guarantee you this is not going to be the case. Do you honestly think there are disproportionately fewer touchdown passes in the CFL than other leagues? There aren't. There are more. We're sacrificing 5 yards of depth in the end zone just so that, well, at least the upright isn't in the way. But expect 60 more touchdowns per year? That's just pathetic. There's no way that's happening. How is getting rid of the goalpost going to offset losing 325 square yards of end zone and boost how many touchdowns we get? It is so blatantly obvious that that's not going to happen. And also that it's an injury liability for receivers in its current location is just ridiculous because the NFL still has this problem just as often, if not more often, than the CFL does with passes down the middle. So let's look at what the CFL has to say about why the end zones are getting shrunk. I have to say, I absolutely died of laughter reading the first reason for this. Maintains the CFL having the biggest end zones of any pro football league. They're literally saying that shrinking it is fine because we're still bigger than everyone else. Well, yeah, but you're smaller than right now. Who on earth cares if 15 is more than 10? It's not 20, and it's certainly not the 25 that the league had until 1986. Next reason, ensures scoring remains high. Again, their only argument for this is, well, at least it's bigger than 10. It doesn't say just as high, it just says high. And plus, field goals being harder, less room for scoring touchdowns, and preventing Rouges out the back is not going to ensure scoring remains high. That's obviously wrong. Then it says, preserves the importance of the kicking game. Bro, again, not an argument. The only thing they're saying is, it could be worse by being 10. Given that they're scrapping Rouges out the back of the end zone, I don't really see how this does anything to preserve the kicking game. The last one is the most interesting, that it allows all league end zones to be the same size. Okay, well, it's not every other CFL team's fault that BMO wasn't designed for football, the end zones are 18 yards, and Percival Molson has a track, which leads to truncation. Again, reducing the end zones to 15 yards would limit scoring. Do you honestly think games at BMO and Percival Molson are any less high scoring because of the end zone limitations? The Argos scored 58 points in 2024's East semifinal, 52 against BC in 2025, and Hamilton scored 64 there in 2019. That's not a big enough issue to punish the rest of the league and all of amateur Canadian football with. Not to mention this will drastically increase the number of 2-and-outs. On a windy day, or if the starting kicker is injured, no one would bother to kick a field goal from their opponent's 30-yard line if it's going to be 52 yards. Ordinarily, in situations like that, a team would just choose to punt for a single so that there's a shot at either a point, an onside recovery, or pinning the other team deep in their end of the field if the kick goes short. But as we'll talk about later, having no untouched Rouges means that there's no incentive for the punter to kick it as far as he can, because the new rules would punish him for doing that when it goes out the back for no points and a touchback. So to summarize, if a team gets a third down at their opponent's 30 and isn't sure if they can make a 52-yard field goal, thanks to Stuart Johnston's new rules, their safest option would be a 29-yard pooch punt out of bounds to pin their opponent at the 1. How dramatically entertaining. The worst part of this is that most amateur Canadian kickers ordinarily cannot make a 52-yard field goal, which means that this would be happening pretty much any time a high school team gets a third down in opposing territory not in the red zone. Canadian high school football is already pretty low scoring. There was a provincial final in Alberta a few years ago that ended 3-2. But considering that there is usually no overtime for their games, I wouldn't be surprised if this brought at least a couple 0-0 ties, especially if the Rouge is ever scrapped completely. The next one is that the field will be reduced to 100 yards to make teams start closer to their opponent's end zone. So hold on a minute. We made sure the end zones remain the biggest in pro football because that's super important, but the field for some reason doesn't matter? If starting closer is the issue, why not just make it 90 yards? Not to mention the end zone experience is now going to suck with the action being further away, just so some, as the league puts it, premium seating can be added. 110 yards is a tribute to how big rugby fields were back in the early days of Canadian football. It's dumb to make it a tribute to America in the same calendar year they are actively threatening our sovereignty. But I at least get the logic here a little more. If you saw my rebuttal video to this dumb article by someone who clearly knows nothing about the CFL, you may remember how I mentioned that NFL goalposts being 10 yards further back is offset by CFL fields being 10 yards longer. But when a CFL team now has to punt from their opponent's 30, any new fan who watches the CFL for the first time will not be thinking in their head, well, I guess mathematically it's only 5 yards further of an attempt if you take into account the field being shrunk. Of course not. They'd be thinking this is stupid, a league where they punt from the 30? The CFL addresses this by saying that this will encourage more aggressive play calling on third down. Well, that's obviously not true. Does any legitimate CFL fan think NFL teams take thrilling risks on fourth down because they have a shorter field? No, they don't. No NFL player plays every game thinking this field is short because there's no reason to compare it to the CFL. And if most CFL players are American, how will seeing 100 yards make them go, oh, I get it, we need to take more gambles? To be clear, if the field was shrunk to be in accordance with the goalposts being moved, midfield would have to be the 47.5-yard line to make the field 95 yards. Field goal distances will be further away. There will be fewer Rouges, which we'll talk about later. The idea that taking away this scoring will be offset by fewer players running into the goalposts and possibly scoring more touchdowns is just pathetic. One player this year, Charleston Rambo, has run into the goalpost obliviously, and it was in preseason. And before that, the last at least significant time was a Rough Riders DB. In that case, the goalpost actually helped the touchdown be scored because it let Brian Burnham be wide open for the touchdown. Any football fan can tell you that field goals don't happen once every 8 years, but running into posts seems to. So if the reasons for moving the goalpost back don't hold up, and moving the goalpost back is the only justification for shortening the field, then therefore there cannot be a sensible reason for shrinking the field to 100 yards. Now, the CFL made this graphic to show where in the end zone most touchdowns go, and they show how quarterbacks are hesitant to throw down the middle. However, if you showed where on the field most passes go, it would probably be the same. Especially now that CFL defenses primarily do zone defense and can have two safeties standing down the middle of the field, waiting for a long pass down the middle, do you really think the goalpost is the biggest deterrent? Also, all the league would have to do to change this would be to say that a pass off the upright is just a reset of the clock and a repeat of the down, just like when the kick hits the scoreboard. Why hasn't Johnston proposed getting rid of the scoreboard at BC Place because punts hit it more than passes hit goalposts? Because there's an obvious thing to do, just repeat the down. It's that easy and way cheaper. Now for the one that I'm sure you're the most eager to hear about. Why on earth, CFL highlights, would you find kicks out the back of the end zone no longer being Rouges offensive? It's so dumb. You miss a field goal and get a point? Bush League. Well, the people who sit on uncomfortable chairs at 50 Wellington Street for a living seem to agree with you. In the CFL's weird propaganda-like explanation videos, we see Supreme Commissioner Johnston clearly annoyed by having to explain that existing rules allow for a game-winning missed field goal, as we see footage of Hairo'ahu's 59-yard game winner against Saskatchewan in 2024.
Now, what we have removed from the Rouge is a single point awarded for a missed field goal that goes through the back of the end zone, or a punt or a kickoff that goes through the back or the sides of the end zone. Whether it goes straight through or bounces in the end zone and goes through, there's no single point awarded.
The CFL has tried to sum this up as a fairness issue. It's not fair that every once in a while a game is won on a missed field goal according to the people who the public entrusts with the rulebook that allows that. If you look at the rationale section for untouched Rouges being taken away, they don't even give a rationale. They just list what it is, but call it a why. That's not a why at all, that's a what. Take a look at every game-winning Rouge in the 21st century. Going backwards, we have Edmonton on a punt in 2024, Toronto on a missed field goal in 2024, Saskatchewan on a kickoff in 2023, which is the only time a game has ever been won on a kickoff Rouge, the Argos on a missed field goal to clinch first place in the East in 2022, the Lions on a missed field goal in 2019, the Riders on a punt with 2 minutes left in 2017, the Argos on a missed field goal in 2011, the Argos on a punt in 2002, the Argos on a field goal which Pinball told his kicker to miss in 2001, and the Argos again in 2000 on a punt. Now, you'll notice that not every CFL team is accounted for here. Does that mean only the Lions, Riders, Elks, and especially the Argos have found themselves in situations where the score is tied and they have the opportunity to break it with a Rouge for the winning point? Of course not. It's just that these teams chose to take advantage of that. Longtime CFL fans will know that in 1966, the CFL had its only 1-0 game, with Montreal beating Ottawa on a missed field goal in the fourth quarter. Believe it or not, since that game 60 years ago, Montreal has not had a game-winning Rouge. They have had plenty of opportunities to do this, but every time they go for the field goal and choose to make it. So it can't be an issue of fairness if teams have plenty of say in how they attempt the winning points. Even with the examples given above, if you eliminate all the ones that were on punts, since punting through the uprights is not a field goal and therefore a Rouge on a punt can't be an issue of failure, and all the ones that still had time left on the clock after the eventually winning point was scored, and all the ones where the returner had possession of the ball in the end zone, and all the ones where we have proof that the coach told the player to miss, the only one left is the 2024 Hairo'ahu example. But of course, the league isn't banning game-winning Rouges alone. They're punishing all of the CFL and all of Canadian football, high school, university, amateur, you name it, by banning all Rouges that are not conceded because of basically one game that no one would remember had it not been for the ending. That's obviously pathetic. What's also pathetic is this. Take a look at this play from the 2022 East Final. Everyone was celebrating this as a Rouge because it was assumed Chandler Worthy touched the ball. When it wasn't because they ruled he hadn't touched it, this prompted the league in the offseason to make all kickoffs that go in the end zone and are not brought back out Rouges, because before that it had to be touched by a player to be a point on kickoffs specifically. Everybody in the CFL world was celebrating this change in 2023. So why would it be sensible to undo this to an extreme level just 2 years later? If the Rouge is directly correlated to getting new fans, as the CFL and Stuart Johnston seem to believe, well, I mean, technically, viewership of the CFL went up from 2022 to 2023. So wouldn't that be proof that making Rouges more commonplace is what needs to be done to get new fans? Let's also talk about why a kick to the end zone is a point in the first place. Since football is a game of field position, it makes sense that there is a reward for good field position. And since the end zone is the goal area, it makes sense that in at least some circumstances you should score by kicking into the goal area. With the current location of the goalposts and current depth of the end zone, a Rouge out the back of the end zone without bouncing or being touched has to be executed from a place where the team's field position is so good that they can add an additional 20 yards to the ordinary target of the uprights. Now, on the surface, this doesn't make sense. If the target for a Rouge is further back, then wouldn't teams always go for a field goal since it's worth 3 times as much and it's closer? That's a win-win. And yes, you're right, which is why when a team does punt for a Rouge, it can't be considered unfair because they're choosing to make a harder-to-execute play for less gain. Not to mention that the punter is 15 yards behind the line of scrimmage. In the case of Jake Julian's game-winning Rouge, the Elks figured a roughly 69-yard punt out the back was safer than a 41-yard field goal. Not many teams really take that kind of risk, and when they do, it's highly entertaining. So if the CFL wants entertainment and risk, keeping Rouges on kicks out the back is a proven way of doing this. Okay, yeah, CFL highlights, but what about missed field goals that go out of bounds? Usually they are trying to get it through the uprights and they miss and get a point anyway. Well, again, if the CFL wants to incentivize and reward good field position, this is a much better way of doing it than shrinking the field to a more American-influenced length just so that there is less bad field position to have. Take a look at what set up Hairuahu's game winner. The Argos kicked off after tying the game up, and a holding penalty on Saskatchewan pushed them back to the 8. The Argos defense then forced a sack to put the Riders at the 1, and then a little bit later they had to punt. So the Argos defense stepped up to give the Riders terrible field position. When they punted, the Argos offense was able to get the ball a little closer before Hairuahu stepped on the field, missed, and won the game. So as you can see, all three phases of the game, offense, defense, and special teams, contributed to the ultimate goal of football, having good field position and giving the other team bad field position so you can score more points. And that's exactly what they did. In many American leagues, if a team is at their 1-yard line and it's 4th down, they'll just concede a safety, meaning the defense is rewarded 2 points for forcing bad field position for the team on offense. So if 2 points is reasonable for the defense alone doing this, why wouldn't 1 be for all 3 phases contributing to this just because there wasn't anything the returning team could do to stop this? By the way, that's literally how field goals work too. In the case of a field goal, there doesn't need to be as good field position because it's 20 yards closer than the back of the end zone. It's worth 3 times as many points, and the only way the other team can stop it is to block it or hope for a penalty. So if you look at it that way, a Rouge out the back is almost more fair for the Riders to lose on here than a field goal because it rewards 2 more Argos phases than just the special teams, but is worth 2 fewer points. Under Johnston's new rules, a game-winning Rouge would be possible on a 15-yard short field goal. What exactly is that rewarding other than the other team with good field position? The defense and offense didn't do anything to get close enough for a field goal, and the kicker was 15 yards short. So unless the uprights are at the front of the end zone, keeping the Rouge in this weird bastardized form is clearly just a move for the CFL to defend accusations of becoming more American and keep traditionalists by not scrapping it entirely. Now let's take a look at the Argos 2022 home opener against Montreal. Toronto scored only 1 point in the fourth quarter, and they won the game by a margin of 1 point, 20-19. So where were all the people on the internet complaining that the Argos won because of a fourth quarter Rouge? The thing is, that 1 point they scored was not the final scoring play of the game. It confusingly ended with David Cote missing a field goal for a Rouge that made the final score 20-19 instead of 20-18. So while the internet was saying a missed Montreal kick lost it for the Owls, in reality a missed Toronto kick won it for the Argos, because had they not missed earlier in the quarter, Cote's Rouge at the end of the game would have been enough to tie the game up at 19. So what's my point here? No pun intended. The point is that the people who do complain when there's a game-winning Rouge are totally oblivious to the CFL outside of that, because had they actually taken the time to watch, they would be furious about Beattie's earlier missed kick just as much as any actual last-play game-winning Rouge. So therefore, the Rouge does not necessarily discourage people who do otherwise express interest in the CFL from watching. It just provides people who are firm in not watching with their only exposure to Canadian football. To put that more simply, they didn't watch before they heard of a game-winning Rouge, and they didn't decide to watch afterward. But regardless, they were exposed to CFL content. Now that game-winning Rouges are borderline impossible unless another CJ Sims incident happens, those types of people will go from not having watched the CFL to not having watched the CFL. There is no change. At least when there were still game-winning Rouges, it was the most exposure people who had only otherwise heard of the CFL in passing ever got to the league. And the best part is, this nuance of Canadian football was not introduced by a bunch of people sitting around in a boardroom talking about how the game should work, but was invented almost 200 years ago by schoolboys in the UK and brought over to Canada, where it was incorporated into football because it was the logical, coherent thing to do. You kick the ball into the goal area, you should get a goal. Field position is important, let's reward good field position. Now with Stuart Johnston's short field and limited Rouges, it's hard to define what good field position even is if a third down at the opponent's 30-yard line is going to be too difficult to score from. And plus, if you're used to 4-down football, the defense only needing to force a 2-and-out should be super fair if you expect defenses to force 3-and-outs. And by the way, there are probably going to be more games won with kicks out the back of the end zone because the goalposts are back there now, and any game-winning field goal attempt, even if there were fewer of them, would have to go out the back of the end zone untouched. And in the same way, the only hope for the other team is to block it or hope for a penalty. But now it's worth 3 times as much. And if you're still convinced that all the other game-winning Rouges were rewards for failure too, consider that the number of game-tying Rouges forcing overtime since regular season overtime was introduced in 1986 is 2. Obviously, overtime is not the ideal, so we can be 100% sure that the kickers were trying to make it. So if there have been 11 missed field goal game-winning Rouges since 1986, does that mean that teams find themselves tied in the fourth more than finding themselves down 1? In other words, if a miss on a last-play field goal attempt is a failure, shouldn't the number of game-winning Rouges and game-tying Rouges be similar? Why do they only fail when it wins them the game? Or does it mean that it's reasonable to expect that in at least a few of the tied situations, the kicker knew that the back of the end zone was as much of a target as the uprights? If you're still not convinced that this is ethical, may I remind you that the Rouge is just as fair as a home run in baseball, but I don't see many people complaining about the fielding team not being able to stop a walk-off solo home run into the upper deck. Now, of course, baseball is not really a game of field position, so it doesn't translate perfectly, but you get the point, literally. At the end of the day, though, the most likely reason the CFL is trying to get rid of untouched Rouges is because it will allow people to bet more money on CFL games. People are hesitant to bet a lot of money because of the CFL's unpredictability. Take away most Rouges and all of a sudden the game becomes mostly 7s and 3s, just like the NFL. People can be more confident with their selections, will put more money on their predictions, and the league will get more money. Is there a more American approach than that? The next 2 rule changes are much tamer and more inconsequential than the first 4. Now, the audio for this section might sound a bit different because I had to re-record after I realized my initial concerns with the 35-second play clock were actually not all that sound. However, keep in mind, this is the CFL, and they haven't properly explained how the 35-second clock is going to work in the final 3 minutes. Let's take a look at how the clock works now. The play ends. The referee can take his own time to spot the ball. Once it's spotted, a 20-second clock starts. If the next play doesn't start within those 20 seconds, it's a 5-yard penalty. Under the new rules, just like the NFL, the play clock will start right after the end of the previous play, and the ref will spot the ball while it's running. The big concern was that if anyone gets the ball within the last 35 seconds, they can just kneel it down, which will lead to fewer big comebacks. But that's actually not true. Remember, the referee will now spot the ball while the 35-second play clock is running, but not the game clock, which will still stop after every play. So unless he spots it instantly, there's no way having 35 seconds left on the game clock is a guaranteed kneel down. Chances are it would be more like 25-ish seconds, which is worse than 20, of course. But remember that the game clock itself only starts when the ball is snapped in all of these many scenarios, and not when the ball is whistled in, which I guess won't be a thing anymore. So it's not actually going to affect how much time is left on the game clock by very much. But that being said, the CFL thinking that this is a detail that prevents people from becoming new fans is silly. Out of all the things I've heard CFL haters complain about, this has never been one of them. And you might wonder why it's 35 seconds instead of 40 seconds. The only reason why the CFL made it 35 seconds instead of 40 seconds is just so that when people research the CFL for the first time, they can go, wow, the CFL is clearly a faster-paced game. Every play happens 5 seconds sooner. And also because if they made it 40, that would be one of the most explicit examples of imitating NFL rules. So ultimately, this rule change is only here because it's a sneaky way of trying to get people to be impressed by the CFL's rules while not losing people who would be concerned about Americanization. Now, if only one rule change absolutely had to go ahead, and I could decide which one, I would pick the sidelines being on opposite sides. This does require every East Stadium and BC Place to undergo some changes. I don't really think that any player has ever brought it up to the league that his team was suffering because their bench was on the same side as their opponent, but again, it's not like this will have detrimental effects on the game, so I'm not too worried. The reason why East teams have benches on the same side and West teams on opposite is just because that's what the IRFU and WIFU did respectively before the CFL was a thing in 1958. BC Place was built in 1983, and they decided to break from West tradition and put the benches on the same side so that the far sideline could be the same for both football and soccer. Now here is one thing to think about though. If you look at the far sideline of BMO Field, they have premium blue seats at field level that cost $250 that will have to be taken out because the sideline benches will be blocking it. But interestingly, one of the CFL's listed advantages of shorter end zones is premium field level seating. Interesting. But to be completely honest, even after thoroughly dissecting why all of this sucks, the bigger problem is that the CFL has the mentality that rule differences are the thing preventing it from getting new fans. But you need to ask yourself why they are even called rule differences. Saying the CFL has rule differences implies that everything needs to be compared to American football. When I became a CFL fan when I was 10, I had no clue what the heck NFL rules were. Canadian football was just Canadian football, so therefore there was nothing different about it. I grew attached to it because of what it was on its own. So the fact that the CFL could think its rules are preventing Canadian NFL fans from following Canadian football as a sport proves that their mentality is just, how can we be more like the NFL while keeping the CFL traditionalists? Unfortunately, though, there is not a single rationally minded, level-headed CFL fan, or NFL fan really, who goes around saying, the CFL's marketing team is genius, if only the rules were different. It's the exact opposite. CFL rules are genius and CFL marketing is terrible. Case in point, take a look at this 2023 promo the league made for the Labor Day weekend.
All right, let's see what's going on out in Alberta. Hey, Gino, give me one word to describe the Stamps.
The who?
Oh, hey, Reggie, did you hear that?
All I hear are red and white touchdowns. A lot of them.
Red and white to red and black.
We see every team, even Ottawa, who had a bye week, featured. It's pretty cool. Now, where did the league show that video? On their YouTube channel, their Facebook page, and on the TSN broadcasts of the Labor Day weekend games. In other words, the little effort they did put into marketing Labor Day just went to the TV screens of existing CFL fans who were already watching what was being advertised. Also, consider how amateur stadiums are now asking the CFL to pay for their field modifications. If the league can afford that, why can't they afford what new fans are actually asking for? A video game, a 10th team in the Maritimes, family discounts and activities at games, showing away games at movie theaters. Because if these quote-unquote innovations Johnston is implementing are going to work, it would be impossible without those other things just listed, so the cost is therefore significantly greater. And let's just face it, for the CFL to be more like the NFL, it raises the question of why the CFL even needs to exist as a separate entity. The correct answer is because they play two distinct sports that both deserve separate leagues for that reason. But Johnston and the rest of the CFL don't seem to care. The league has this absolutely ridiculous explanation for why the evolution of the game does not make the CFL less Canadian. The CFL will always be very Canadian. These changes are about increasing entertainment while supporting and maintaining the traditions of our game, such as 3 downs, 12 players on the field, the waggle, and much more. These changes make our game more exciting and more entertaining. The league has seen rule changes before. Before 1929, throwing the ball forward was illegal. Imagine when the league altered that rule. At one point, the East Division used to play 2 games with the total score determining the winner, while the West Division played a best-of-3 series. Imagine that format today. The CFL, like every other successful, long-standing league, has continually evolved and innovated over the years, and will continue to do so to benefit fans and strengthen the future of Canadian football. The reason why that first part is stupid is because Johnston has publicly stated that he's not exactly opposed to the idea of switching to 4 downs. That's a very dangerous thing to say given how obvious it is that his new rules will lead to less scoring. The second part is dumb because anyone who was upset about the forward pass in 1929 had the option to keep watching rugby separately and let football fans watch football. But now, these alleged innovations do not allow for fans to keep watching Canadian football as it is, as having junior Canadian football play a sport with no professional league makes no sense. Why can't the CFL have the mentality that they and the NFL can coexist doing different things? Because the owners of teams want money and they see what NFL owners can do. Especially Keith Pelly, who runs MLSE, who owns the Argos. In Argos general manager Michael Pinball Clemens' memoir, All Heart, My Story, he talks clearly about how superior the Canadian game is to the American one. Yet, in this press conference after the new rules were announced, he gives a very aloof answer about his feelings about the rules.
What do you think about the changes here?
Well, the very first thing is we're looking at getting better. We're looking at growing, doing things a little bit differently. Your best is always good enough, but your best should get better. right? Because if your best doesn't change, the world is moving around you, right? Things grow and they get better. And so these are changes that I haven't had a chance to digest everything just yet, right? But it is working at getting better. I mean, our game is awesome now. But we should always be looking to improve.
Because if he were to speak out clearly, it would create tension between him and his boss, Keith Pelly, whose vision for the Argos is pretty much nothing but farm team for the Bills. Given that there is no obvious owner for the Argos if Pelly were to sell the team, it makes sense that the league would have to go along with his and the other owners' demands if they wanted to remain financially stable. Pinball, of all people, should be furious about the goalposts being moved, literally, because his whole career was returning missed field goals and punts. It's obvious to me he is uncomfortable with these changes, but he can't say it because then, like Nathan Rourke, he would have to have a talking to from the almighty Stuart Johnston or from Pelly. And speaking of missed field goals, the first highlight video the league put out after the announcement was the plays of the week for Week 16, and the number one play they promoted was a 128-yard missed field goal return touchdown by Trey Vavel that is going to be impossible in a year and a half. They're promoting what they want to be impossible. Back to the forward pass. In 1929, the IRFU players were the ones pushing for the change of the forward pass, and the media generally opposed it. Now it's the opposite. The out-of-touch NFL-loving elites are the ones trying to convince us that this is going to be good for the league, while the players, fans, and minor leagues found out on the same day with absolutely no say. And also, it wasn't any league that did this, it was the CRU, the 1929 equivalent of Football Canada, the national body for football across the country that did this. I know I've been talking about the rule changes as if they are a nationwide thing, when technically there's no obligation for U Sports or the CJFL to go along with this. But by virtue of being the highest level of professional Canadian football, it's ultimately redundant for any of those leagues to keep playing without the CFL's rule changes. So in effect, it does force all levels of football to change. The next point about the best 2 out of 3 format being unfathomable is ridiculous. Whoever wrote this paragraph clearly had no idea about this until they were told to write it down, because they forgot to mention that this was a playoff format and not a regular thing, as seems to be implied here. The reason why there were 2 different playoff formats is because that's what the East and West conferences independently decided to do until 1970. The league did not force this format, and it wasn't an integral, foundational aspect of the game in the same way that goalposts at the front is. It wasn't like every high school and university had to do this too. And by the way, starting in 1986, the league allowed weaker divisions to skip playing a semifinal and play a 2-game total points final. So in that case, this format was considered progress after it was initially abolished. Would it be considered progress today now that we have the crossover? I don't think so. And in the same way, when people look back at these new changes, they will question how anyone ever thought of it as being progress when every game ends 17-10. Lastly, the whole every other sport has evolved blah blah blah. Yeah, and every time they evolved, they made more of everything. Bigger keys in basketball, more space behind the net in hockey. The CFL is the only league in the world that tries to progress by making less of everything. They must have a super specific reason for doing that, like maybe, I don't know, imitating a richer league that does less of everything. But that doesn't really make any sense. The highest attended enclosed sporting event ever was a Brazil-Uruguay soccer game in 1950, with reports of up to 200,000 people in attendance. So if the NFL could profit off of that kind of attendance, why don't they just change the rules to make every game a Brazil-Uruguay soccer game? Well, that's stupid. Brazil and Uruguay already have their own soccer teams, and the NFL exists to be the top American football league in the world. The CFL exists to be the top Canadian football league in the world, and as it turns out, Canadian football is played on a 110-yard field with goalposts at the front. People who work for the CFL really do not like Canadian football rules. You'll notice that other major leagues like the NFL, MLB, and AFL all have rule explanation videos on their YouTube channel. The last time the CFL made a rule explanation video was in 1993 with a half-hour-long TV promo hosted by Ron Lancaster called Longer, Wider, Faster. Shouldn't that be the basics of marketing yourself? Explaining what you're all about? The fact that they haven't is 10 times more embarrassing than a pass hitting the upright. Or if you look at the recap of the 2025 Saskatchewan at Toronto game, we see the Riders marching downfield up 31-24. Then it just cuts to the Argos having the ball and Saskatchewan being up 32-24. Of course, what happened was that Lowther missed a field goal, and even though that literally changed the ending of the game because the Argos had to go for 2, apparently that was too embarrassing for whoever made the recap. So what was the reaction of CFL fans to all of this? Well, many of them were outraged. That's great. Petitions were started and calls for Johnston to resign were made obvious. But as the playoffs got closer, people started not caring as much. Many CFL fans have just sort of accepted it as something out of our control that is just going to happen. Ironically, that's the most Canadian response of all time. It doesn't help that all of the media is on board with this, because rich people who work for TSN and Sportsnet do not like the CFL because it is a working-class league. Take a look at Paul Lapalisse commenting on this missed field goal return.
Field goal team covering down, making sure Sean Bain doesn't get, this is one of the most explosive plays in the Canadian Football League, is missed field goal returns.
He obviously hates that this is going to go away, but like pinball, he can't say that as explicitly as Nathan Rourke because he works for people who idolize the NFL over the CFL. And on that note, for anyone who still does not believe that unique rules are what draws people to the CFL, just look at the name of any CFL podcast or blog. 2 and Out Podcast, 55-Yard Line, or this band called Kick Out the Rouge. Shouldn't that be the biggest indicator to the league of what it will take to get new fans? That all of them who make independent CFL content brand themselves on the 55-yard line and 3 downs? And speaking of independent CFL content, I know that there are people who work for the CFL who watch my channel, and unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised if their opposition to the Rouge, for example, was based on my compilations giving them more examples. If that is the case, I'm sorry about that. In many ways, my channel, CFL Classics, CFL Fan 31, Free Down Productions, and all the rest have done way more to promote the league than the league itself. I had to pay around $75 to get footage of the 1963 Little Miracle, and I don't make any money off of my recap of it. The CFL owns that footage, and they literally could have made the exact same video I did for free and got monetized from YouTube for it. That's just a testament to how the priorities of the CFL and its fans are different because the CFL is not run by people who considered themselves CFL fans before they got their job. To make things even worse, the CFL has instructed security at stadiums to confiscate anti-rule change signs. So what I am proposing is to anyone who is attending the Grey Cup in Winnipeg this year, do not leave once the game is over. Wait until Johnston comes out to announce the MOP and MOC, and boo him loudly. What are they going to do? Confiscate your voice? We can't wait until 2026 to be angry about all of this. Email and call anyone you can who works for Football Canada, the CFL, Canadian Heritage, literally anyone. Because if the CFL truly has its fans at the core of its interest, would it be unreasonable for the league to listen to them?